The discovery in the ruins. The ancient temple's crystalline spires pierced the violet sky of Nexus VI, their once brilliant surfaces now dulled by centuries of neglect. Thomas Harrison adjusted his atmospheric suit's filters as he navigated through the crumbling corridors, his boots crunching on shattered fragments of what appeared to be living crystal. The expedition was supposed to be routine: document the ruins, collect samples, move on. But something about this place felt different. His scanner hummed with unusual energy readings, leading him deeper into the temple's heart. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying an electric charge that made his skin tingle, even through the protective suit. The temple's architecture defied Earth's understanding of physics. Gravity seemed to shift and bend around certain chambers, and light danced in impossible patterns across the walls. The scanner's steady rhythm suddenly spiked, accompanied by a sound that shouldn't exist in these abandoned ruins, a soft, melodic whimper. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where his pulse pistol rested. 20 years of xenoarchaeology had taught him that the universe's most beautiful discoveries often hid the deadliest secrets. Following the sound, he entered a vast circular chamber. Suspended in its center was a cocoon of crystalline energy, pulsing with a faint blue light. Inside, barely visible through the translucent surface, was a humanoid figure. As he approached, the cocoon's surface rippled like liquid glass, and 2 eyes opened within, eyes that held the color of distant nebulae. "Stay back," a voice echoed in his mind, feminine and fierce, despite its weakness. "I will not be taken again." Thomas raised his hands slowly, keeping his distance. "I'm not here to take anyone. My name is Thomas Harrison, xenoarchaeologist from Earth. I'm here to study these ruins." The crystalline surface began to dissolve, revealing a figure that made Thomas question everything he knew about alien physiology. She appeared almost human, save for the intricate patterns of light that flowed beneath her translucent skin, and the crown-like formation of crystals emerging from her temples. Her clothing, though tattered, bore the unmistakable marks of royalty, flowing fabrics interwoven with living crystal. "Earth," she repeated, testing the word. So far from the empire that once was. She struggled to stand, her legs trembling. Without thinking, Thomas moved to support her, expecting resistance. Instead, she accepted his help, her skin cool against his suit. "I am Lyra, last sovereign of the Crystal Throne," she said, her voice carrying both pride and profound sadness. "Or at least I was. Now I am nothing but a refugee in my own temple." Thomas helped her to a fallen column where she could sit. "What happened here? These ruins are centuries old, but you?" "Time flows differently in the stasis crystal," Lyra explained, gesturing to the dissipating cocoon. "I chose eternal sleep rather than face execution at the hands of my own council. They feared what I would become, what I was becoming." Her fingers traced the crystal formations at her temples. "Our people learned to bond with the living crystal, to shape it with our thoughts. But in me, the bond grew too strong. They said I would bring destruction to our empire." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. They didn't realize their fear would bring that destruction instead. Thomas studied her with growing fascination. His scanners indicated energy patterns, unlike anything recorded in the xenological database. "And now, what will you do?" Lyra's eyes met his, and in them he saw something that transcended the vast gulf between their species: desperation. "I cannot return to my people. The empire is gone, and those who survive would only seek to finish what they started." She hesitated, then continued with careful words. "In our culture, there was a tradition for those who lost everything. They could pledge themselves to a protector, becoming what you might call a ward or a pet. Thomas finished, understanding dawning. "You're asking." "To belong to you," she said simply. "To place my life and loyalty in your hands in exchange for protection and purpose." Her fingers clutched at the crystalline growths on her temples. "These powers within me, I cannot control them alone. I need someone to ground me, to give me boundaries." Thomas felt the weight of the moment press down on him. Every scientific instinct told him to refuse, to maintain professional distance. But something else, something more human, saw the pain and fear behind her royal bearing. "If I agree," he said carefully, "you have to be honest with me. About everything. No secrets about your powers, your past, or what might be coming for you." Lyra stood, her full height impressive despite her weakened state. With fluid grace, she knelt before him, taking his hand and pressing it to her forehead. Where their skin met, he felt a surge of energy, like static electricity but deeper, reaching into his very thoughts. "I, Lyra of the Crystal Throne, pledge myself to your protection and guidance," she spoke, her words carrying the weight of ancient ritual. "My power is yours to command, my loyalty yours to direct, until such time as you release me from this bond." As the last word left her lips, the crystals at her temples pulsed with light, and Thomas felt something shift in the air between them, a connection forming that defied scientific explanation. He helped her rise, already wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. "We should leave," he said, noticing new energy signatures on his scanner. "This place won't stay abandoned forever." As they made their way through the crumbling temple, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far larger than himself. Behind them, the living crystals pulsed with renewed energy, as if awakening from their long slumber. In the shadows of the temple's deeper chambers, something else stirred, something that had been waiting for this very moment. The game of power and protection had begun, and its consequences would echo across the stars. Bonds of trust. The soft hum of Thomas's research vessel, the Horizon Seeker, filled the silence as they navigated through the debris field surrounding Nexus VI. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's chair, her crystalline features catching starlight in mesmerizing patterns. The past 48 hours had been a blur of hasty departures and careful explanations to his research base about his discovered artifact. "Your vessel," Lyra spoke, breaking the silence. "It's quite primitive." Her words carried no malice, only curiosity. The crystals at her temples pulsed gently as she observed the manual controls. Thomas smiled despite himself. "Compared to crystal-powered ships, I suppose it is. But it's reliable. Sometimes primitive is better than complex." He adjusted their course, avoiding a particularly dense cluster of debris. "Speaking of which, we need to talk about your powers." Lyra's posture stiffened slightly. "The bond requires honesty. Ask your questions." "These crystals," Thomas gestured to her temples, "they're not just decorative, are they? They're growing." She touched them self-consciously. "Yes. The living crystal responds to emotional states, to needs and desires. In most of my people, the growth is minimal, controlled. But in me," she trailed off, her expression darkening. "In me, it grows faster, stronger. The council said I was becoming a crystal entity rather than remaining merely bonded to one." A warning light flashed on the console, and Thomas noticed several instruments flickering as Lyra spoke. He made a mental note. Her emotional state affected nearby electronics. "And this pet bond you've proposed, how does it help with that?" The ancient texts spoke of focusing crystals, Lyra explained, her voice taking on a scholarly tone that reminded Thomas she was royalty. A strong will that could guide and contain the crystal's power. My people feared such bonds because they meant giving another person influence over your very essence. She met his eyes. But I believe it's my only chance at control. Thomas considered her words carefully. You're putting a lot of faith in a stranger from a primitive species. You could have left me there, she replied simply. You could have treated me as a specimen, a research subject. Instead, you showed kindness. The crystals at her temples brightened. Besides, I've seen into your mind just a touch during the bonding. You are good. Before Thomas could respond, the ship's proximity alerts blared to life. A massive vessel had just dropped out of hyperspace directly in their path. Its design was unlike anything in Earth's database, but the crystalline formations along its hull made its origin clear. No, Lyra whispered, fear evident in her voice. They found me so quickly. The crystals at her temples flared brilliantly, and suddenly every system on the Horizon Seeker went dark. Lyra, Thomas called out in the darkness. You need to calm down. Your emotions are affecting the ship. He heard her ragged breathing in the darkness, felt the temperature dropping as crystal formations began spreading across the ship's interior walls. I can't go back, she gasped. They'll terminate me. They'll say I'm too far gone. Thomas reached out in the darkness, finding her hand. At his touch, she jerked away, but he held firm. Hey, look at me, he said softly. Remember the bond? You're mine to protect now. I won't let them take you. The crystals in the cabin pulsed with a softer light, and slowly the ship's systems began to return. The massive vessel loomed closer, and now Thomas could see figures moving behind its crystalline viewport. Humanoid, but their forms seemed to shimmer and shift like light through prisms. Unidentified vessel, a voice echoed through their comm system. You are harboring a dangerous fugitive. Power down your systems and prepare to be boarded. This is your only warning. Thomas felt Lyra trembling beside him, but his mind was already racing through options. The Horizon Seeker wasn't built for combat, but he hadn't spent 20 years exploring dangerous ruins without learning a few tricks. Trust me, he whispered to Lyra, then opened a channel to the pursuing ship. This is Dr. Thomas Harrison of Earth. I'm conducting authorized research in this sector. Your presence here violates 3 different interstellar treaties. Human, the voice replied with obvious disdain. This matter is beyond your understanding. The entity you protect is no longer legally a person. Stand down. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. Really? Because I have documentation proving otherwise. His fingers flew across the console, preparing the ship's emergency protocols. Would the Galactic Council be interested in learning how you're conducting unauthorized executions in Earth-controlled space? There was a pause, and Thomas used the moment to enter final commands into the ship's computer. Beside him, Lyra watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. You are making a grave mistake, human, the voice warned. That creature will destroy everything you hold dear. It is already happening. Thomas glanced at the crystal formations spreading through his ship, at the woman whose powers could easily tear the vessel apart. But he also saw the fear in her eyes, the desperate hope that someone would finally stand by her. She's not a creature, he replied firmly. She's my ward. And if you want her, you'll have to go through proper diplomatic channels. His hand hovered over the emergency controls. Or we can see how your fancy crystal ship handles a concentrated burst of tachyon particles. The pursuing vessel's weapons powered up, but Thomas had already acted. The Horizon Seeker's emergency system engaged, releasing a massive burst of energy that momentarily disrupted the crystalline ship's systems. In that moment of confusion, Thomas engaged the emergency jump drive. The stars blurred around them as they leaped into hyperspace, leaving their pursuers temporarily blind and disrupted. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. That was unexpected, Lyra said quietly, studying him with new eyes. You risked everything. Well, Thomas replied, checking their systems for damage. That's what you do for family, even newly adopted crystal-powered alien family. He offered her a small smile. But we're going to need to work on your control. I can't have you shorting out my ship every time you get scared. Lyra nodded solemnly, but Thomas noticed the crystals at her temples glowing with a warmer light. I think, she said carefully, I made the right choice in choosing you as my keeper. As they sped through hyperspace, Thomas wondered if he could say the same. The crystal formations throughout the ship pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their pursuers' warming held more truth than he wanted to admit. But looking at Lyra, seeing the mix of vulnerability and strength in her bearing, he knew he couldn't have chosen differently. Sometimes the most dangerous path was also the right one. Rising shadows. The trading outpost on Helios Gate was exactly the kind of place Thomas had spent his career avoiding, a sprawling maze of interconnected habitats where questions were discouraged and credits bought silence. But after 3 weeks of running, they needed supplies and information. The Horizon Seeker's hull now bore elaborate patterns of crystal growth that no amount of removal could permanently stop, making mainstream ports too risky. Thomas watched Lyra as she moved through the crowded marketplace, her crystalline features hidden beneath a hooded cloak. She had grown stronger since their escape, but with that strength came complications. The living crystal had spread further across her skin, creating intricate patterns that pulsed with her heartbeat. More worryingly, objects around her had started to crystallize spontaneously when her emotions peaked. The merchant in the red pavilion, Lyra whispered, her voice carrying directly into Thomas's mind. Another new ability that had manifested. He's watching us too carefully. Thomas casually adjusted his course, guiding them down a different alley. How many 3 following? Their minds taste like home. Crystal touched the gems at her temples, flickered beneath the hood. They're trying to hide their presence, but I can feel them now. I can feel everything. That last statement sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Over the past weeks, Lyra's awareness had expanded dramatically. She could sense electrical systems, read surface thoughts, and even manipulate the molecular structure of certain materials. The power that had frightened her people was growing, and sometimes Thomas caught her staring at her hands with a mixture of wonder and terror. They ducked into a dimly lit tavern, finding a corner booth where they could watch both entrances. A server drone approached, but sparked and shut down as it neared their table. Thomas noticed small crystals forming on its surface. Sorry, Lyra whispered, closing her eyes and concentrating. The crystals receded, and the drone reactivated, continuing its rounds. It's getting harder to control. Everything wants to. Change when I'm near it. Thomas leaned forward, keeping his voice low. We need to talk about what's really happening to you. The full truth, Lyra. You promised honesty. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table's surface, leaving temporary crystalline trails. My people discovered the living crystal centuries ago. We learned to bond with it, to shape it with our thoughts. But we were always taught that we were the masters, that the crystal was a tool. She looked up at him, her eyes swirling with nebulous colors. They were wrong. What do you mean? The crystal is alive, Thomas, truly alive, and it wants to evolve. Through me, Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm not just bonded to it anymore. I'm becoming something new. The council saw this starting and tried to stop it, but they didn't understand. It's not a corruption, it's an evolution." A commotion near the entrance interrupted them. The three followers Lyra had sensed entered the tavern, their cloaks doing little to hide the crystalline formations on their faces. Unlike Lyra's organic, flowing patterns, theirs were rigid and artificial, forced bonds rather than natural growth. "Princess Lyra," one called out, his voice resonating oddly in the suddenly quiet tavern. "The time for running is over. You can feel the changes within you. You know we were right to fear this." Thomas reached for his pulse pistol, but Lyra placed a hand on his arm. Where she touched him, he felt a strange tingling sensation, and he noticed with alarm that small crystal formations had begun to spread from her fingers onto his suit. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and there was real regret in her voice. "I didn't want you to see this yet." She stood, letting her hood fall back, revealing her transformed appearance. The living crystal had spread to frame her face in an ethereal crown, and her skin seemed to shift between solid and translucent. The tavern's patrons began to flee as the air itself seemed to crystallize, forming beautiful but deadly patterns. The pursuing agents raised weapons, but Lyra merely gestured, and the weapons transformed into delicate crystal sculptures. "You fear what you don't understand," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystal formations resonate. "The crystal chose me because I could embrace change, could become more than what we were." Thomas watched in awe and growing concern as she moved forward. The floor beneath her feet transformed with each step, creating a spreading pattern of crystalline growth. The agents backed away, their own crystal formations seeming to react painfully to her presence. "Lyra," Thomas called out, trying to reach her through whatever was happening. "Remember the bond. Remember who you are." She turned to look at him, and for a moment he saw conflict in her eyes. Then one of the agents took advantage of her distraction, throwing a stasis device. Time seemed to slow as Thomas dove forward, knowing he couldn't reach her in time. But instead of trapping her, the device simply dissolved into crystal dust as it entered her sphere of influence. Lyra's expression hardened, and with a gesture, she encased all three agents in crystal cocoons, similar to the one Thomas had found her in. "I remember who I am," she said softly, turning back to Thomas. "I am becoming what I was meant to be. And I need you to help me control it, to keep me human enough to use this power wisely." Thomas stood slowly, noting how the crystal formations had spread to cover nearly half the tavern. "And if I can't? If this evolution consumes you completely?" She moved closer to him, and despite everything he'd just witnessed, he didn't step back. The crystal patterns on his suit pulsed in sync with hers. "Then you'll have to stop me," she said simply. "That's why I chose you. Your humanity, your compassion, but also your strength. You'll do what needs to be done." Around them, the crystalline growth continued to spread, transforming the dingy tavern into a cathedral of living crystal. Through the windows, Thomas could see similar patterns beginning to spread across the station's walls. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now, before the whole station transforms." Lyra nodded, closing her eyes and concentrating. The crystal growth slowed but didn't completely stop. As they hurried back to the Horizon Seeker, Thomas couldn't help but wonder if he was protecting her from the universe, or protecting the universe from her. The encoded warning from her pursuers played in his mind. "That creature will destroy everything you hold dear." Looking at the trail of crystalline transformation they left in their wake, he feared they might have been right, but for all the wrong reasons. Power unleashed. The Horizon Seeker limped through space, its systems struggling against the ever-spreading crystalline growth. Thomas had stopped trying to remove the formations weeks ago. They always returned stronger, more intricate. The ship's interior now resembled a living geode, beautiful but deeply unsettling. In the cargo hold, now transformed into a crystalline chamber, Lyra levitated in meditation. Her transformation had accelerated after the incident at Helios Gate. The living crystal now covered most of her body, making her appear more ethereal being than humanoid. Only her eyes remained unchanged, still holding that spark of individuality that Thomas clung to as proof of her humanity. "The frequencies are changing," she announced, her voice resonating through the crystal-laden ship. "They're coming, but differently this time. Not just hunters, an armada." Thomas checked the ship's sensors, but they had become increasingly unreliable, affected by Lyra's growing power. "How many?" 13 capital ships. They've united the remaining crystal-touched houses. Her feet touched the floor as she descended, creating ripples of energy through the crystalline surfaces. "They believe destroying me will save them from evolution. They're wrong. I'm just the first." The words chilled Thomas. Over the past weeks, he'd watched her power grow exponentially. She could restructure matter at will, communicate across vast distances, and tap into energy fields he hadn't known existed. The scared princess he'd found in the ruins was becoming something beyond human comprehension. "Lyra," he said carefully, "we need to talk about what happens next. These changes." "You're afraid," she stated simply, moving closer. Where she passed, the crystal formations became more complex, more alive. "I feel your fear, Thomas. But I also feel your hope." She reached out, touching his cheek. The crystal patches on his own skin, slow-growing marks from their continued contact, resonated with her touch. "I'm afraid of losing you," he admitted. "Not to them, to this." He gestured at the transformed ship around them. "You're becoming something incredible, but are you still you?" Before she could answer, the ship shuddered violently. The armada had arrived, dropping out of hyperspace in an attack formation that surrounded them completely. The lead vessel was massive, its crystalline hull pulsing with aggressive energy. "Last warning, human," a familiar voice echoed through their communications. "Surrender the entity or be destroyed with it. What she becomes will remake reality itself. Everything will change." Thomas looked at Lyra, seeing the power swirling just beneath her crystalline surface. "Maybe change isn't always bad," he said to both her and their pursuers. Lyra smiled, and for a moment he saw the princess he'd first met. Then her expression hardened as weapons fire from the armada converged on their position. The attack never reached them. The energy beams crystallized in space, creating a beautiful lattice of frozen light. Lyra raised her hands, and the ship's hull became transparent, giving them a clear view of space around them. "I tried to hide," she said, her voice carrying to all ships now. "I tried to run, but you forced my hand." The crystal formations throughout the ship pulsed with blinding energy. "You fear change because you cannot control it. But evolution cannot be controlled. It can only be embraced." Thomas watched in awe as waves of crystalline energy poured from their ship. The nearest vessel's weapons dissolved into sparkling dust. Another ship's engines crystallized, leaving it dead in space. But Lyra wasn't destroying them. She was transforming them. "The living crystal chose me for a reason." Her voice resonated through space itself. "To bridge the gap between what we are and what we could become. To show that evolution doesn't mean losing ourselves. It means becoming more than we ever dreamed possible." The transformation spread from ship to ship, not destroying but changing. Thomas saw crew members through the crystalline hulls, their forms shifting as the living crystal embraced them. Some fought it, some accepted it, but none could stop it. "Lyra," Thomas called out, seeing the changes beginning to spread beyond the fleet, reaching toward nearby stars. This has to be their choice. You can't force evolution. She turned to him, her form now almost pure energy contained within a crystalline shell. "Then help me show them a better way. That's why I chose you, to keep me balanced between what was and what could be." Thomas stepped forward, his own partial crystallization resonating with her power. "Then let them choose. Show them the possibility, but let them decide. That's what makes us human, or whatever we become. The power to choose." For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then Lyra nodded, and the forceful transformation slowed, becoming an offering rather than a demand. The crystal energy still reached out, but now it waited for acceptance rather than forcing change. "Choose," she broadcast to the fleet. "Choose to evolve or remain as you are. But know that the future cannot be stopped. It can only be shaped." As the Armada hung in space, individual crew members began to accept the change, their forms shifting as they embraced the evolution she offered. Others remained unchanged, watching in wonder or fear as their colleagues transformed. Thomas took Lyra's hand, feeling the power coursing through her. "And us? What do we choose?" She turned to him, her form settling into something between human and energy being. "We choose to guide. To show that change doesn't mean losing what we love. It means finding new ways to love, to exist, to be." Around them, the universe sparkled with possibility, waiting for choices to be made. Breaking chains. 3 months after the standoff with the Armada, the Horizon Seeker drifted near the edges of known space. The ship had become a living thing, a perfect fusion of technology and crystal that responded to both Thomas and Lyra's thoughts. They were no longer fugitives but ambassadors of a sort, helping others understand and adapt to the changes spreading through the galaxy. Thomas stood at the viewport, watching distant stars sparkle through the crystalline hull. His own transformation had stabilized. Patches of living crystal merged with his human form in a way that felt natural now. He wasn't fully changed like Lyra, but he wasn't entirely human anymore either. He had found his own balance. "The Nexus Council is meeting again," Lyra announced, her form shimmering as she manifested beside him. She had mastered her new existence, able to shift between solid and energy states at will. "They're still struggling with the idea of voluntary evolution." Thomas smiled. "Change is never easy. We're asking people to reimagine their entire existence." "And yet you adapted so easily," she observed, her hand finding his. Where they touched, their crystalline elements resonated in harmony. "When you found me in those ruins, did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Becoming part crystal and helping guide an evolutionary leap for multiple species." He chuckled. "Can't say that was in my xenoarchaeology training." Their conversation was interrupted by a signal for a nearby system, another group ready to explore the possibility of transformation. Since they had stopped forcing the change and started offering guidance instead, more and more people had begun to seek them out. "They're afraid," Lyra said, reading the signal's emotional undertones. "But also hopeful, like I was when you found me." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Fear and hope often go hand in hand. The trick is helping them find their own balance, just like we did." They set course for the signal's origin, the ship responding to their combined intent. As they traveled, Thomas reflected on how far they'd come from their initial roles of protector and protected. They were partners now, balanced between what was and what could be. Do you ever regret it? Lyra asked suddenly, taking on my bond, starting all of this. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, past the crystalline surface, past the godlike powers, to the core of who she was. She was still there, still the same soul he'd chosen to protect, now evolved but not erased. Never, he said firmly. You asked me to help you control your power, to keep you grounded. Instead, you helped me see that growth doesn't mean losing yourself. It means becoming more truly yourself than ever before. The ship arrived at their destination, a small mining colony on the edge of space. Below, thousands of people waited, ready to learn about the change sweeping through the galaxy, ready to make their own choices about evolution. Shall we? Lyra asked, her form solidifying into something closer to her original appearance, though still magnificent in her crystalline glory. Thomas nodded, his own patches of crystal glowing in response to her presence. Together. Always together. As they prepared to meet the colonists, Thomas remembered the words that had started their journey. Let me be your pet. How far they'd come from that desperate plea. Not pet and master, not even protector and protected, but partners in showing the galaxy that change, while frightening, could lead to something beautiful. The living crystal spread throughout the universe, not as a force of destruction, but as an offer of transformation, and at the heart of it all, a former xenoarchaeologist and an alien princess turned evolution guides, proving that the greatest changes come not from force, but from choice, not from fear, but from love. As they descended to the colony, the stars sparkled above them, each one holding the possibility of new change, new growth, new ways of being. The future they had helped create stretched out before them, infinite in its potential, beautiful in its uncertainty. The story of the abandoned princess and her human protector had become something else entirely, a tale of evolution, choice, and the courage to become something new while holding on to what matters most. In the end, it wasn't about control or protection at all. It was about breaking the chains of what was and daring to imagine what could be.